Imagine walking into a bar with your friends on a Friday night, and a security camera catches every single second of it. You laugh, you order a drink, you talk to people you know, and then you tell your friends you're going to say goodbye to someone else in the crowd. You walk back into that room, and you're never seen again. Not on that camera, not on any camera, not on a single traffic light, ATM, or storefront recording anywhere in the city. No credit card charge, no phone call, no text message, no body, nothing. Just a man who walked into a building on camera and, according to every scrap of evidence investigators have gathered in nearly 20 years, never walked back out of it. This is the disappearance of Brian Shaffer, and it remains one of the most unsettling, unsolved missing persons cases in American history. On the night of March 31st, 2006, Brian Shaffer was 27 years old and living the kind of life a lot of people spend years working toward. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, on track to become a doctor. He was engaged to be married. He had a close, steady group of friends, a stable home, and by every account from the people who knew him, absolutely no reason to walk away from any of it. No secret debts, no drug problems, no history of running from responsibility. Just a smart, well-liked young man who had just finished a brutal stretch of exams and wanted, like a lot of exhausted students do, to blow off some steam. That night, Brian went out with friends to celebrate the end of exam week. The group ended up downtown, in the Arena District of Columbus, Ohio, at a crowded bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. If you've ever been to a bar like that on a weekend night, you know exactly what it looked like. Wall-to-wall people. Music too loud to really talk over. Drinks being passed hand to hand through a crowd that never seems to thin out. It's the kind of environment where losing sight of someone for a few minutes isn't unusual at all, which is exactly why, at first, nobody panicked. Witnesses that night described Brian as relaxed, in a good mood, not visibly overwhelmed by alcohol, not upset, not anxious about anything. Just a guy enjoying one of his first nights of freedom after a stressful semester. Somewhere around 1 a.m, his friends started talking about heading somewhere else. Brian told them he wanted to go back inside for a minute to say goodbye to some other people he recognized in the crowd. He walked back through the doors of the Ugly Tuna Saloon, and that is the last confirmed moment, the last verified sighting of Brian Shaffer alive. Here's where this case stops being a typical missing person story and becomes something that still makes investigators uneasy to talk about today. The bar had working security cameras covering its entrances and exits. When Brian didn't come home, and police eventually pulled that footage, they expected it to hand them the answer almost immediately. Footage like that usually does. It shows someone stumbling out with a stranger, getting into an unfamiliar car, getting into an argument on the sidewalk, something. Instead, the tape showed something far stranger. Brian is clearly visible on camera walking back into the bar, sometime around 1:15 in the morning. And then, he simply is not there anymore. He does not appear walking out the front. He does not appear walking out the side. Investigators reviewed every angle of coverage the bar had, and Brian Shaffer does not appear leaving through any exit that was being recorded. Now, to be clear, nobody investigating this case believes anything supernatural happened. The leading theory from police has always been some combination of camera blind spots, gaps in coverage, or the simple chaos of a packed bar, making it possible for one person to slip past a lens completely unnoticed, especially if he left through a door that wasn't being monitored as closely, like a kitchen exit or a delivery entrance. That's the boring, logical explanation, and it's probably true. But here is the detail that keeps this case alive online and in true crime communities nearly 20 years later. Even if he slipped out some unmonitored door, that only explains how he might have left the building unseen. It is nothing to explain what happened after that, because after that single frame of him walking back inside, Brian Shaffer does not appear on a single other camera anywhere. Not in a downtown entertainment district full of bars, restaurants, hotels, and traffic cameras, on a Friday night when the sidewalks were still full of people. He is not on any nearby businesses' surveillance. He is not on any ATM footage. He does not appear crossing a single intersection. In an era of near constant recording, he becomes, in an instant, completely and totally untraceable. His friends assumed at first that he'd made his own way home, or left with someone else, or caught a separate cab. The kinds of assumptions people make all the time on a chaotic night out. It wasn't until the next day, when Brian didn't answer his phone, didn't show up, and didn't come home to his fiancée, that real concern set in. And within a day or two, that concern turned into a full missing persons investigation. Police hit a wall almost immediately, and it's a wall that has never really come down. Brian's car was still sitting in a nearby parking garage, completely untouched. His wallet never turned up abandoned anywhere. His keys never turned up. There was no trail of purchases on any of his cards after that night. No fresh charges, no withdrawals. And his cell phone, which should have been the single easiest way to trace his final movements, simply went silent. No calls placed. No calls received. No location data investigators could use to pin down where he went after leaving that bar. It was as if his entire digital footprint simply stopped existing at the exact same moment the camera lost him. Detectives worked through every angle you'd expect in a case like this, and a few you might not think of right away. They looked closely at his relationship, because in cases where someone vanishes, police almost always start with the people closest to them, not out of suspicion for its own sake, but because statistically, that's where the truth is usually found. Nothing ever pointed investigators in that direction. They looked at his finances, hoping to find some hidden pressure, some secret debt that might explain a man choosing to walk away and start over somewhere new. Nothing turned up there either. They considered the possibility that Brian simply wanted a new life, that the pressure of medical school had become too much and he'd made the decision to disappear on his own terms. But everyone who knew him described someone who was excited about his future, not someone quietly planning to abandon it. They looked hard at the bar itself, too. There were reports, never fully confirmed, of some kind of minor altercation happening somewhere in the crowd around that same general window of time. And for years, that detail fueled speculation that something violent might have happened to Brian in the chaos of an overcrowded, poorly lit room, something that could have been hidden or covered up in the noise and confusion of a packed Friday night. But no witness ever placed Brian at the center of any confrontation, and nothing was ever definitively connected to him. As the investigation dragged on, public pressure and media attention grew, and law enforcement threw a significant amount of resources at trying to find him. Search parties combed wooded areas on the outskirts of the city. Police brought in sonar equipment to search the Scioto River, which runs directly through downtown Columbus, on the theory that if something violent had happened, his body could have ended up in the water. They searched storm drains. They searched alleys and abandoned buildings nearby. Cadaver dogs were brought in to comb through likely areas. None of it produced a single physical trace of Brian Shaffer, not then and not in the nearly 2 decades since. Tips came in over the years, the way they almost always do in cases that receive national attention. People reported sightings of someone who looked like him in other states. One tip claimed to place him working behind a counter hundreds of miles from Columbus, living under a different life entirely. Every single one of those leads was investigated, and every single one of them dead-ended into nothing. In 2014, 8 years after that night, a judge legally declared Brian Shaffer dead, a legal formality more than an actual resolution, something that allowed his family a narrow measure of closure on paper, while the real mystery of what happened to him remained, and still remains, completely unanswered. No remains have ever been recovered. No arrest has ever been made. There has been no confession, no confirmed motive, no confirmed cause of death. Nothing solid enough to close the book on what actually happened inside or just outside that bar. What keeps this particular case circulating online? What keeps it showing up in true crime videos and forums and late-night conversations nearly 20 years after it happened isn't simply the fact that a young man disappeared. Tragically, people vanish every single year, more often than most of us like to think about. What makes Brian Shaffer's case different is that one specific, deeply unsettling detail. We have him on camera walking into a public building surrounded by other people, and then, according to every piece of evidence ever gathered, we simply do not have him walking back out of it. In a world where it can feel like almost everything is recorded somewhere, by someone, at some angle, His case represents this rare and deeply uncomfortable exception, a gap in the record, a person who existed and was loved and was seen just moments before, and then, according to the evidence, simply wasn't anywhere at all. Some amateur investigators have spent years poring over the layout of that bar, theorizing about back hallways, kitchen exits, delivery doors that may have led out to an alley with no camera coverage at all. And it's entirely possible that's the real, mundane explanation hiding behind the eerie one. A boring, logistical answer to a haunting question. But even if that's exactly what happened, it still doesn't answer the bigger question that has haunted this case for almost 2 decades. If Brian Shaffer simply walked out an unmonitored door that night, where did he go after that? Why has absolutely nothing surfaced since? Not one confirmed sighting, not one financial transaction, not one piece of physical evidence in nearly 20 years. There's another layer to this case that true crime audiences often bring up, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Brian Shaffer disappeared in 2006, right at the edge of the smartphone era. Facebook was barely 2 years old. Most people still didn't carry GPS-enabled phones in their pockets. Surveillance networks in most American cities were far less dense than they are today. So in a strange way, his case sits in this uncomfortable middle ground of history. Recent enough that investigators had cameras and cell records to work with, but not recent enough to have the kind of dense, overlapping digital trail that might exist if the exact same disappearance happened today. Would a case like this even be possible now? With phones constantly pinging cell towers, with facial recognition software scanning city cameras, with location history quietly logging in the background of almost everyone's daily life? It's a question true crime researchers ask a lot, and it's part of why this case feels almost like it's frozen in a very specific, very unlucky window of time. It's also worth remembering that Brian wasn't some isolated figure with no one looking for him. He had a fiancée. He had close friends who were standing right there with him minutes before he vanished. He had a family that immediately noticed something was wrong and pushed for answers from the very beginning. This wasn't a slow burn case where somebody wasn't reported missing for weeks. The alarm was raised almost immediately. And even with that fast response, even with a relatively well-preserved crime scene, even with cooperative witnesses and a department that dedicated real resources to searching for him, the trail still went completely cold within days. That's part of what makes this case so difficult for investigators and so fascinating for everyone else. It isn't a case where the system failed to respond in time. It's a case where the system responded immediately and still came up with nothing. Over the years, the case has been picked apart on true crime podcasts, YouTube channels, and internet forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries, with amateur sleuths building elaborate timelines, mapping out the bar's floor plan, debating camera angles down to the minute. Some have suggested Brian may have wandered off disoriented after one too many drinks and met with an accident somewhere quiet and never made it home. Others believe something happened inside that bar that night, something someone saw and never reported. And a smaller number still hold on to the far less likely idea that Brian is out there somewhere, alive, having chosen, for reasons known only to him, to walk away from the life he built. None of these theories have ever been confirmed. None of them have ever been ruled out completely either. That's the nature of a cold case like this one. Without a body, without a confession, without a single hard piece of physical evidence, every theory stays technically possible, and none of them stays satisfying. Brian's family has never stopped hoping for answers. Over the years, they have continued to speak publicly, asking anyone who might know something, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, to come forward. Cold cases like this one have been cracked before, sometimes decades later, by a single overlooked detail resurfacing, a witness finally deciding to talk after years of silence, or old evidence being re-examined with technology that simply didn't exist back in 2006. For now, though, Brian Shaffer remains exactly what he became the moment he walked back into that crowded room at the ugly Tuna Saloona, a young man who was there, laughing with friends, seconds away from the rest of his life. And then, according to every camera, every witness, and every piece of evidence anyone has ever found, He simply wasn't.